77. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated, and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favour again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Then I thought, to this I will appeal the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron.
Thank you, Isabel. Now, for my birthday, Kaz, my wife, treated us to a trip to Edinburgh, which happened to coincide with the Fringe Festival. So that meant that we got to listen to several different comedians because there were free shows all across the city. So that meant Kaz could spend a few days listening to some good humour rather than having to put up with my bad humour. And there was one comedian who was in one particular dilemma that he was going through. The question he was asking was, who do I love more, Harry Potter or my girlfriend? Now that should be a really easy answer to question to answer, shouldn't it? Well, the issue was he had developed a habit of listening to the Harry Potter books in order to get himself to sleep. He could not sleep without listening to them. But his girlfriend, she was used to sleeping in silence. So I won't ruin the resolution, just in case you ever hear him. You can ponder that one. What happened? What was the outcome? But the reason this comedian used to listen to Harry Potter was to drown out the internal dialogue that was going on in his head. And that's increasingly common, isn't it? Some nights, for many of us, the internal dialogue of our heads keeps us awake and stops us from sleeping. There are mindfulness apps that you can get to help you wind down as you prepare for bed. Netflix has a program that you can watch in order for you to figure out how to go to sleep. You can get these white noise machines so that it's not just deafening silence, but white noise to distract your mind into sleeping. And one strategy I've used recently is to listen to one particular album, one trance album, believe it or not. I don't like trance, but there we are. Listen to that on wireless headphones so I don't strangle myself, and that eventually sends me off to sleep. What is it that keeps you awake at night? Never mind what gets us to sleep. What keeps you awake? What keeps your mind active and buzzing? Is it worries about money? Family or work situations that you're concerned about? Dissatisfaction with your circumstances in life? It might be simply knowing where the next meal is coming from. Or maybe you replay the events of the day in your head and think, how might I have done that differently or behaved in a different way in that situation? Now, the problem for this ancient songwriter, as we shall see, the reason why he was struggling to switch off is that his understanding of God didn't line up with his experience of God. So how do we resolve in our minds and our hearts when what we know of God is different to our experience of God? So let's have a look at the movement this songwriter Asaph goes through in 4 actions. So the first of those actions is seeking in verses 1 to 3. Now, if you've got a problem with someone, if you feel someone has wronged you, then often the best thing to do is to actually go to that person and talk it through with them, rather than, for example, gossiping about it with someone else or stewing over it internally without ever resolving it. That's the approach the songwriter has. He goes to the person that he has the problem with. He goes to God because he has a problem with God. It's important that we grasp the tone of this, though. He's not coming as God's superior. The songwriter is not the boss. God is still the boss. God is still superior. So the songwriter doesn't have an air of superiority, but of humility. And he's also not disconnected from God. He's not coming as a stranger to point the finger at God. He's not mistrusting of God. It's precisely because the songwriter trusts in God that he has a problem with God and therefore can bring it to God. And from that we grasp that when we trust in God, when we know him, then we can actually approach him, we can seek him. Particularly when things don't make sense with God. And we can come to him with an air of humility as we bring our problems to him. Do you do that? Do you bring your problems to God? Do you seek him out when you've got something of concern? But look how persistent and determined the songwriter is in seeking God. It's not just a quick prayer and give up. This is praying and praying and praying and seeking and searching for God to resolve this issue. So have a look at verse 1. It says that he cried out to God twice. And then in verse 2, he sought the Lord. His hands were untiring. He kept on praying to God. He probably raised his hands in prayer like that. That was often a posture that they would pray in. So he kept on praying. So it's another simple question for us to ask. Not only do we seek God when things don't make sense, but do we persistently go after him? Not just one and done, but keeping on going in prayer with God, wrestling with him. And do we do so with a position of humility and trust in God? See, if we are his children, if we have accepted Jesus, if we're Christians, if we know his forgiving love in our lives, then we are invited to seek him. We're invited to seek him whatever our concerns. And if you're not a Christian, you're invited to enter into that relationship so that you can seek him. So the first action is seeking. The second action that the songwriter goes through is questioning, which we see in verses 4 to 9. The heart of the issue here is in verse 6. He's got these songs in the night that are going through his head. And those songs are probably the worship songs that Israel, God's people, would have sung at the time. The Psalms, which is where this song is located. So they would have sung those songs together as God's people. And they say that if you want to know what a church believes, you have to open their songbook more than anything else. Because the worship songs of Christians are so influential in shaping our thinking about God, aren't they? Songs, they have a way of influencing us incredibly deeply, partly because they work alongside our emotions, don't they? And they remain in our heads as we sing them beyond the day that we sang them on Sunday, that we sing them throughout the week very often. So songs have a way of deeply influencing your thinking about who God is and your desires as well. So Asaph, the songwriter, he's recalling these songs in his mind. He's singing them through as he can't go to sleep. And that exposes the problem. Because the songs convey what God has done in the past. But then that's not what God is doing now. What God has done in the past is very different, or looks very different, to how God is working now in the songwriter's situation. And perhaps we felt similarly. Perhaps you've looked to days gone by and you think, God, you did such wonderful things all those years ago. Why not now? You think to a time when God moved in your own heart in a very powerful way, when you were stirred by the Spirit and felt very close to God, or you were doing something very courageous for God, and you think, God, you were doing something great now, but I don't experience that now. Or a time in our church or in our land when God was moving in a powerful way, but you think that's not now. Or maybe as you reflect on God's character, you think, why don't we see that more obviously? You think God is a God of love who desires to save, but my children are far from him. God is a God of justice who rights all wrongs, but there are people in this world who get away with doing terrible things. God is a God of sovereignty who is in charge of it all, but the world seems to go in a constant mess. And if you've never felt those kinds of paradoxes, well, I've given you a reason for a sleepless night now. So good luck with that tonight. Well, we better carry on so that we resolve all of this, haven't we? Well, as the songwriter feels these paradoxes, and as he's sought God out, he brings all of these questions, all these problematic questions to God. I don't know if you heard them as Isabel read them out. We're going to go through them again. But he doesn't hold back. He brings all of these very bold questions to God because he trusts in God and because he knows that God is the only one who can resolve these problems. So he lists them all off in verses 7 to 9. Read them through with me. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favour again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he, in anger, withheld his compassion? Now, when you look at those questions, you can see that God is clearly doing something with his people at this time, something of his discipline, which would have been for their sin. But whatever the circumstances, Asaph is wondering to himself, will this ever change? Is this just how it is now? Well, God, are you going to do what you always promised you would do? God, have you given up on your people? God, have you washed your hands of your people? Has God decided that he's no longer going to demonstrate his love to human beings? Has God had enough of us all? They're quite bold questions, aren't they? Well, the third action is remembering in verses 10 to 15. And verse 10 is really where the tone of the song shifts completely. So have a look at verses 10 and 11 and 12. Have a look at them and ask yourself this question. Who is the songwriter now talking to? He's talking to himself, isn't he? To this I will appeal, I will remember, I will consider and meditate. So he's talking to himself. And sometimes talking to ourselves is the best way to resolve our situation and our thinking. It's not just a sign of madness, it's a sign of sanity sometimes when you talk to yourself. Because it helps you get the right perspective. And right perspective is vital. It's like with those optical illusions. Should we get an optical illusion on the screen, Lee, if you click to the next slide? The question is, which do you see, a rabbit or a duck? Who sees rabbit? Who sees a duck? Who sees both? I'll show you how you can see both. Click again, Lee. Look at that bit. Is that a beak? If so, it's a duck. Is that ears? If so, it's a rabbit. You got it now? There we go. Let's see the next one. Is it an old man or is it a young woman? Who sees an old man? Who sees a young woman? Who sees both? Oh, some of you are too good. Let's have the next click again, Lee. So that's the old man's nose, and that's the young woman's nose. So the young woman looking away and the old man sort of towards us on an angle. There we go. Right, let's get rid of that. But having right perspective on those things can help you. It's one image, isn't it? But if you've got one perspective, you see one image, and if you've got a different perspective, you see a different image. So it's one image, but there's two perspectives you can take. So as Asaph looks to the past, the perspective he's looked to so far in verses 1 to 9 has led him to a paradox, has led him to problems with God, things that don't make sense. It's a case of, God, you were like this in the past. Why does it now feel different? What's gone wrong? But now he's looking to the past with a different perspective. This is where the shift has happened. And this is what resolves his paradox. He looks and says, God, you were like that in the past, and so I can trust that you will still be like that. You see, God's character never changes. And when we remember that, it's a comfort to us. It's helpful. Because then we know what God is going to be like, and we know that God will never act out of character. So God is a God of love and justice and sovereignty. And even when it doesn't look like that, we can assure ourselves that he is still a God of love and justice and sovereignty. So as we reach verse 13, notice, well, have a look, answer the question yourselves. Who is Asaph now talking to in verse 13 onwards? Who's he talking to? He's talking to God. And he remains speaking to God for the rest of the song. So he tells God who he is and what he is like. And he's not telling God as if God has forgotten what he is like, but he's telling God what God is like to remind himself, to assure himself of what God is like. So verse 13, God is holy. He is different from all the other false gods that the false religions worship. God is supreme in his greatness. Verse 14, that God is a powerful God who displays that power amongst his people through things like miracles. So he's reaffirming that God is still like that. God is still holy. God is still powerful. And verse 15, God is still a God who saves. He hasn't changed in that regard. He has rescued his people. He is still the saving God that he always was. And that leads us then to our fourth action, which is telling, in verses 16 to 20. Telling God specifically what he is like. That's how this is different from the remembering. The remembering is more general. The telling is very specific. So Asaph, as we said, he remains in this posture of prayer, speaking directly to God, and he's now telling God about the specific things he has done to save his people. So he launches on from verse 15, where he describes God as a saving God, now to saying about the specific ways that God has saved his people. I wonder, as we went through verses 16 to 19, did you pick up the historic event in Israel's history that he's referring to? Shout it out, someone. The Red Sea. It's the parting of the Red Sea. Yes, the story when God's people were freed from Egypt, freed from slavery, got to the Red Sea, and that was a big barrier. How are they going to get across the Red Sea? Didn't have a boat or a bridge or anything like that. It was very wide and deep. And then the Egyptians came behind them to recapture them, and God parted the Red Sea. With his powerful wind, this storm that happened, the water divided, and there was clear dry land, a path for them to go through as Moses and Aaron led them through that. So the songwriter Asaph, he calls to mind this specific way that God is who he is. And it's helpful for us to do that, to call to mind the character of God, not just in broader brushstrokes, but in specific ways. So we can talk about God being supreme and mighty and holy and a God who saves. But then it's helpful for us to remember specific ways that he is a God who saves. Specific ways that we have seen that in our lives. So the parting of the Red Sea, that was one moment in this whole saving event of God releasing his people from slavery in Egypt. A very defining event, but one event of several. But that saving event of releasing God's people from slavery in Egypt, that was a picture of the greater saving event that God would accomplish through Jesus. You see, by nature, as humans, we are held in bondage as slaves. We are slaves by default. Jesus said in the verses that we referred to earlier that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. So if we have sinned, we have been captured by it. And there is no one who has not sinned. You see, in our society, as our culture, we tend to think of sins as the really bad things that people do. We tend to think of sinners as people like Lucy Letby, who was sent to prison this week for her horrific crimes of killing little babies. And that is up there with how bad we can be as human beings. She is a sinner. But sin is far wider reaching than just the worst things that we can do. Sin is, at its root, the corruption of our being that we are in by default. And that corruption of our being, it causes us to live as we please rather than trying to live how God knows it is best for us to live. And we show that corruption there in our lives every time we do little things that are wrong. So every time we lie or cheat or deceive someone, that's a marker that the corruption is there. Every time we're greedy, every time we're selfish or vain, that's a little marker, a little sign that sin is there within us. There's a corruption at the core of who we are. And these little sins, they hold us as slaves just as much as the big sins would. In fact, you could argue they hold us as slaves more so because we do them more often and think we get away with them. And they hold us as slaves because no matter how much we try to stop, we're never free. Never free from sin. But the very reason Jesus came was to free us from slavery to sin, to free us from the hold, the grip that sin has on us. By dying in our place, he paid the price that was required, the price that would release us from the penalty that sin claims on us. By Jesus dying, he forgives our sins, which means the sin cannot say, I am Jonny's, because Jesus has paid for it. And so the penalty is taken from me because it's given to Jesus, which means I am set free from its penalty. The power that sin has on me and on every Christian is gradually being eroded as the Spirit works in our lives and as he enables us to live to God's glory. And one day, eventually, we will be set free from the presence of sin when we're in glory, the new creation, the new heavens and earth. So it cost Jesus his life to set us free from sin. And we are set free from sin when we trust in Jesus, When we accept that Jesus died for me, it is then that we are set free from sin. And if you know that to be true, that is what makes you a Christian. So here's how such specific remembering helps us. If God has saved me by giving his Son over to death on my behalf and drawing me to himself by his Spirit, if God has done that, then he will keep me. Even through the challenges I face, the temptations I experience, the hardships I have in my life, the paradoxes, whatever else, he will keep me. Because he's given his Son to get me. And what's more, he will complete what he has promised. What he has begun in Jesus, he will bring it to completion by taking me to his eternal home. And if Jesus has begun his kingdom here on this earth, if he has brought some to himself, then he will continue to build his kingdom as across the world people turn to trust in Jesus. His kingdom will continue to grow. Though things might look bleak at times, Jesus' plan hasn't changed. Across the world, his kingdom is growing. Now, as we come to the end of this song, there's no real conclusion. Did he get a good night's sleep? That's the question I'm asking. It's like as if the songwriter has given us all of the ingredients and given us the recipe to follow, but he leaves it open-endedly. He leaves it for us to make that recipe for ourselves, as it were. So the time when you can't sleep because something is bothering you with regards to God, when God seems distant, when he seems to have abandoned you, when he seems to not be moving and working in the way that you expect him to move, how are you going to resolve things in your mind? How am I going to resolve things in my mind? Well, according to the songwriter Asaph, we seek out God. We come to him. He is the one we go to because who else could we turn to? We bring to him our questions, our honest and brutal questions. No matter how big our questions are, God is big enough to handle our questions. And then we remind ourselves of God's unchangeable character. As God was, so God will always be. Even when it doesn't feel like that to me, he still is. And we can then tell God specifically about the ways that he has worked in our lives, how he has saved me and you if we are his. He has given his Son to die for us, to forgive our sin and to set us free. He has moved in our hearts by his Spirit. We have every reason to keep on trusting in him. Let's pause for a moment, shall we? We might have specific things that we want to respond to God with, something that's been prompted in our hearts, something you want to pray in this moment of quietness. So let's have a moment of pausing and reflection, and then we'll sing. May these words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.